Welcome to the Learning Reinvented Podcast, brought to you by myself, Katie Godden.
And James Poletyllo from The Learning Effect. There are lots of learning podcasts out there, so we wanted to do something slightly different. This week, it's the start of 2022, so we wanted to look at the challenges that are facing business in the coming year and what you as learning professionals can do to face these challenges. So, Katie, if we look back to 2021, when we started the year, we were hoping that this was the last year of COVID. It's probably not the last year of COVID, as we can see, new cases wildly springing up across Europe, the UK, and across the whole of the world. And I know you've been impacted as well over the Christmas period.
Yes, unfortunately, my boyfriend and I tested positive for COVID on the 23rd of December. So that kind of stopped our Christmas and New Year plans. So it was very quiet indeed. So lots of Netflix and films that were being watched. But obviously, it's just one of those things and we couldn't do anything about it. And I'm sure there's lots of other people that were in a similar situation as me. And yeah, like you said, I think going into 2022, it's definitely going to not be the end of COVID, unfortunately, but hopefully it will start to go to some sort of normality. I know we were saying that back in 2020, but fingers crossed 2022 is the year where that kind of changes things a bit.
And I think we've had a couple of years of living with COVID now and, getting used to it. And there's been some sort of changes that have driven short-term changes in the way we work, in the way we learn. But also there's been some sort of long-term mindset shifts as well that I think have been facilitated or speeded up by COVID coming along. So despite us not really wanting to talk about COVID, I think a lot of the things facing business this year are COVID driven or COVID inspired. I don't know if that's the right phrase, but they have been the focus of a changing workforce, changing work conditions, changing economy that we faced over the last couple of years. So in your opinion, what stands out to you as the challenges that businesses and our clients are facing in the coming year?
Well, I saw on the BBC News the other day that workplaces should plan for 25% less people due to kind of being off for COVID, having to isolate, etc. So that's going to have a big impact on every business because people are going to have to make lots of changes, upskill people to kind of cover those roles. As well as that, it's being kind of in the plan B phase where we're asking people to work from home where they can as well. So again, obviously we kind of changed that last year and we were starting to go back into the office. But that's now changed to work from home again. So we need to accommodate that and make sure people can comfortably work from home still and have access to the right information, communications, etc. That they did do before. What do you think as well?
I think on top of that, people have been talking about the big resignation or whatever people are banding that, but people have had time to retrain, refocus, reflect on how they live their lives, how they want to work. So it's seeing an instability in the labour market worldwide, but the UK is specifically hit by other factors such as the ongoing fallout of Brexit. The whole world economy is going to be impacted and see changes in markets and sectors, and also if some of those other things you've talked about, working patterns change, that has a knock-on impact as well. So I think there is going to be that potential fallout of the big resignation, and we should be focusing on that and then looking at what that means for individual businesses or industries, and again contextualizing that as to what that means for you. So if we take those as sort of three big buckets for us to work through over the next few minutes. So let's look at that. Business has been asked to look at having potentially 25% less workforce. So again, that came from the government trying to prepare for public services in the UK, having up to a quarter of their staff off at any time. And, it's quite interesting to see that there's almost been a mindset shift again around attendance at work when you're ill. Because if I think back 3 or 4 years, when I was working in-house in organisations, the culture in lots of organisations were, unless you were on your deathbed, you came into work. You literally came in, suck it up, deal with it, come to work, potentially spread colds and viruses to other people, and that's just what we did. And it seems that, you know, through having a very focused view of an infectious disease, that's possibly going to change the way people approach just being around other people when they are ill, or they do think that they might have some sort of illness or infection.
Yeah, I think that's a really positive change to actually make, because like you said, you felt kind of obliged to go in even if you had a horrible stinking cold, and then you're probably going into offices that have got aircon, and then you're spreading it everywhere and you're actually making everyone else ill. But obviously with COVID, it's kind of highlighted the fact that it can be spread and it is extremely infectious, and people can have it in different variants as well. Like, I got it and tested positive, but I didn't feel anything. But then I know other people that have got it and they've had a more mild version of it. They've been really tired, they've had headaches, aches, etc. And then obviously you get people that get it more severely. So you don't know the impact. So I think that's positive, and I think it's a positive attitude to have in a workplace. But obviously, if you're missing kind of a quarter, potentially, or up to a quarter of your workforce, you've got to do things to enable your business to keep running, because you don't want to start losing out on profit, etc. And you need to think about that as a challenge in itself. So how can you have transferable skills? How can you teach people the skills so they can cover other people's roles if they are off sick? And I think that's what people really need to be focusing on, is being able to deliver that effectively, as opposed to just having huge chunks of their business out of work and not being able to be as productive as when they're there.
Yeah, and I think we're moving from, you know, over the last couple of years, we've found out more and more about COVID, more and more about how we respond to it. You know, there's obviously protections being in place with people getting vaccinations, etc. But I think that learning to live is really important message that I don't think, and this is again a personal view, but I don't think we're going to be rushing to as many sort of national lockdowns or global or regional lockdowns as we have been in the past. Obviously, unless, you know, a new variant comes that's particularly problematic for or causes, you know, a mass amount of hospitalizations. But I think what you will see is the continued measures that we've got in place, that if people get an infectious disease, workplaces will be requiring people to stay away, and them, you know, there may be legislation or just regulation or insurance or whatever else that requires people to operate in that way. So learning to live with COVID will be learning to live with infectious disease becoming something that requires people not to be in the workforce, which sort of has two repercussions. One of, as you said, we need to be, as a business, thinking about, we might have spot outbreaks of stuff, and how do we cope with that? So, you know, if a particular department or team goes down, how do we have contingency measures in place? But also across other teams, how do we make sure that our skill base, or one person is not responsible for business critical delivery, and that we have that spread of skills, or we have contingency plans or just in time learning in place, so that we can redeploy people as needed to support the ongoing delivery of business. So I think that's one of the implications. And the other is being able to potentially work from elsewhere as well, maybe not on a permanent basis, but as required. So, for example, you had COVID over Christmas, and, you know, timing wise, it was a time where you were due to be off work anyway. But if that had been at a time when you were working, because you had mild symptoms, you could have actually continued probably quite happily to be working, rather than just sat watching Netflix because you're contained in your house. So, but it's allowing people to be in that position, that if that's the case and they are actually fit to work, just not fit to socialise or be outside their home environment, maybe ensuring that people can work from home. And again, we'll get on to talking about whether working from home permanently or blended working is a solution. But I think in response to that 25% out of the workforce being out, or even more in cases, businesses really need to think through their plans for how they approach that.
Yeah, I think it's about being flexible and sensible with it, because obviously if you're kind of working in kind of warehouse construction, those things that you have to do your job on site basically, that's going to impact those types of industries like a lot more than kind of an office job where, like you said, if you've got mild to no symptoms similar to what I had, you'd happily work from home, because you weren't impacted heavily by it. It's just you have to self-isolate, and that's another thing as well with the self-isolation. It's a legal requirement that you do stay at home, so that's another thing that's impacting these businesses. It's if you do test positive, you legally have to stay at home and self-isolate, because you can be fined up to £1,000. So I think it's just working with what's legal and what's law, and then being sensible and finding those sensible, flexible ways around that in order to keep kind of businesses running, because people aren't going to want to just sit at home and self-isolate if they're not feeling anything, you know what I mean? Unless they're really poorly and just need to rest. But people aren't going to want to do that if they're not, and they understand that they have to self-isolate, and they understand that they can carry on working. But I think it's just about being sensible with that, and I think COVID in itself has made us more flexible to those types of things anyway. Like you said, working from home, that's become more of a norm now than it ever had been before COVID, which I think personally is a positive thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the implications for business are completely down to the type of work that you're doing. So, like you said, if you're in a manufacturing or a construction environment, you need to be on site to carry out that work. The same in a service or a retail or a care environment or whatever else it happens to be. And some of those businesses, you need a continuity of service, or you drop off in service. So for certain things, you might turn around and go, okay, a retail site, if everyone goes down or 50% goes down, you might reduce the delivery hours, or you might do this, or you might need to bring in, temporary members of staff, casual members of staff. You might need to redeploy people from a different branch. You then come across to something where you actually can't have an option of dropping hours or closing a site. So if you're delivering something like care or an essential service, you have to work out how are you going to redeploy, how are you going to reskill people. So I think that context helps set the challenge that you as a learning team should be facing, and understanding what your operational plans are and those contingencies, and putting your creativity into thinking, how can we help with this business challenge? How can I not be going and selling a learning course to these teams, but how can I be going along and thinking about how do we support that business continuity, the service continuity, or whatever else it happens to be. So I think there's a real opportunity for learning teams to ensure that they're positioned correctly and helping the business as best needed.
Yeah, I think it's about empowering your people as well, to give them the confidence for them to be able to have that flexibility and have that confidence to be able to, like you said, maybe go into a different store to work there if they're in retail or care or whatever. But I think if you don't have that, and you kind of let people fend for themselves a little bit, and you're not providing them with that kind of daily update on kind of what new rules are in place, what rules impact their business, etc. I think that's where you're potentially going to lose people, and that's where you come to like the last point that we're going to talk about is that kind of great resignation, because people haven't got that confidence, they haven't got that happiness, they've not got that positivity to actually want to and that empowerment to actually stay in the business that they're working in, because obviously they're feeling a bit neglected.
Yeah, and I think making sure that you can support your workforce flexibly, you've got the right element of support, you're not throwing people in at the deep end, that you're providing sensible support. So again, in a multi-site business, are your rules consistent enough and your processes consistent enough that people can move from branch to branch? And do people locally understand the nuances of their branch? So if I rock up in branch number 2, I normally work in branch number 1, they can say to me, these are the 10 things you need to know about this branch, without taking me through the 20 things that everyone working for our organisation already knows, because they're common and consistent. So there's some really sensible things that you should be looking at in terms of how your business operates. I think if we then spin on to the working from home option, I think as well as sort of emergency working from home, there's been a culture and mind shift about working from home is something that becomes more normalized, and it always has been in certain roles, but there seems to be a work from home, obviously, edict at certain times where possible, but that where possible, I think, has forced more creativity than would have been before COVID. But it's looking going forward as to what does that really mean for your business. So as with lots of discussions, it seems to be quite divisive. So you have some people who are, yes, we can do everything working from home, and other people is everything has to be in the office. And, it's where's the right contextual middle ground for you. So, what works for your business, what works for those individuals, and what works for the people you're trying to attract and bring in. And I see a lot of stuff around recruiters talking about the fact that, they've got some businesses that are pushing and saying everything must be in the office, that's the only rule, etc., and they're struggling to get candidates through. And I think if people see that maybe you've got inflexible policies and an edict that doesn't make a lot of logical sense, I think people are more likely to push back and pick and choose whether you're following those rules. So I think getting that balance right around working from home is critical, to impact on that last point you're going to come to around the big resignation and making sure that you can keep, attract and retain employees.
Yeah, because I think working from home, irrelevant to COVID anyway, I think it's an important part of your working life. And I think COVID's been the catalyst of that, and people can see that it's got both positives and negatives to working from home consistently anyway. But I think if you provide that level of flexibility for your employees, so if they need to work from home on several days, or it suits them because they've got childcare issues or they've got other commitments, etc., or it allows them to have different flexible working hours as well. I think they're really positive things, and I think if workforces don't have those, like you said, they become then less attractive businesses for people to potentially want to go and work at. But then it also has the negatives that when you're always working from home, you're kind of forcing people into that routine as well, and you're kind of taking away those social elements of working anyway, because you're kind of forcing people to have to make that kind of more social calls. So I think when you work from home, you book in a lot of meetings because they're meetings relevant to your work, and you miss out on those things that you get in a workplace where you can just have a good conversation when you walk into the office. Say hello, how was your journey in, how was your commute, what did you watch on TV last night? You lose all of those kind of little mundane bits of conversation that you have throughout the day, but that kind of keep you sane. And then when you're at home all the time, you're just kind of booking in meetings literally just to talk about whatever the meeting's about. So I think that's a potential negative to it. But if you've got that flexibility where you can kind of do both, I think that's a really positive outlook to have on it. From a learning point of view, I think you have to have the infrastructure in place to be able to support that as well. So you're not just pushing like face-to-face learning, for example, that you've got that flexibility where you might have things on Zoom calls, or you might have content that's online so people can access it anytime, anywhere that suits them, and at the hours that suit them as well. Like I said there previously, that if you're working at different hours because that suits your day more, you've still got access to that training because it's not restricted to 9 to 5, because that's when their trainers training. I think a learning team's got a big responsibility to help push that out to the workforce and make it work really well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you look at the challenges facing people working from home, and each person's experience is very different, and I think it creates some real challenges and opportunities for HR teams and learning teams. Because if you go back into some of my roles when I was in corporate roles, I would spend most of my day in meetings, and effectively I could flip those roles now, and I would spend most of my day in Zoom meetings, and it would feel pretty similar, and at the end of the day I'd be left with a chunk of work and actions that you just have to fit in around the edges. But you might have saved time on a commute and stuff, so maybe you can do those things, but again, maybe you don't have that time on a commute to do some of the learning, go on LinkedIn, listen to podcasts. So there's different things that have changed for that type of role. But I then think about other roles which are maybe more individual contributors, and thinking, well, now I could go into a role and be onboarded by receiving a laptop through the post and whatever that happens to be, I could spend most of my day just carrying out tasks, and maybe I wouldn't have that level of interaction with people. And what engagement might I have with that employer beyond the working policies, beyond people thinking about how to keep me engaged, between the next person who, if I resign and offers me 5p an hour more, or a couple of £1,000 a year more to go to a different role, to come in and say, well, they just send me a different laptop and I do a different set of tasks. So I think it creates a real set of challenges for people to understand the context of the role and the benefits that it provides to people, and what individual motivators are, and how do we connect with and engage with people in not just a transmit way. And again, we work a lot with people on learning platforms, comm strategies, all of those things. But if we just think we're going to broadcast, have a nice induction where the chief exec talks to you, etc., you to go through a learning plan, etc., I think it's got to be so much more than that. So I think it really pushes us to think about, what does that learning and engagement what need to be? How are we supporting the rest of the business and the HR team to build that employee and employer experience, so that we understand what that relationship is? How do we monitor people? How do we provide opportunities? How do we open up talent pools? How do we understand what's going on? How do we understand and help support good leadership within that new way of working? So I think there's huge amounts of challenges and opportunities for learning to reinvent how it approaches its delivery, but also reinvents its position in the organisation, because just pushing out content, pushing out programs, or pushing out courses, are those really going to impact when the way of working might be so much more flexible and different? And like you said, someone might have a flexible working policy that allows them to do more work at home, and go and do school pickup and log back on when the kids go to bed, because that's become normalized and that's accepted, and those are my hours, rather than just having to work around the system. But if my learning system doesn't meet me in that way, and I don't have the support at 10 o'clock at night, or access to the learning I need to complete or do a new task, then we're not being flexible and adaptable. So I think there's huge amounts of change and challenge available.
Yeah, definitely. And it kind of going back onto your point as well about moving, so where you've got like the less workforce you might have to kind of pick up in a different site, etc. If you've got a flexible and kind of bite-sized approach to learning, you're able to achieve that a lot easier, rather than having huge lengthy programs where you're kind of maybe delivering big workbooks out to people that they've got to read through, or that's now online but they're just clicking through a big workbook and that's their store induction or that's their site induction. Whereas if you kind of take a different approach and you kind of chunk that down into a bite-sized approach, you're then able to become way more flexible, and you can take those relevant bits and you can make sure that people have got access to the right information when they need it. So site one, you've got to now go and work in site two, right? You've done everything that you need to do in site one, but site two does X, Y, and Z that's a bit more than what you've done in site one, but here's the access to it. That can be instant, and that's how you can do that. But I think a lot of learning teams haven't got that approach, and it's still very program based. It is quite lengthy, and you haven't got that bite-sized mindset. So those things are a lot more harder to achieve, but can be achieved quite simply by just breaking stuff down.
Absolutely. And I think if we boil this down to treating the workforce well and being able to work flexibly, adapt, have an appropriate approach to working, and also an appropriate approach to learning, can therefore make you a more attractive employer, can help you retain people, stop the big resignation, or make you a beneficiary of the big resignation elsewhere, because people are coming to choose to work for you because you've got those things right. And I think there's lots of things that learning teams can do for that. And we've talked about making people comfortable in their role. You've just talked about bite-sized learning and how that can help people to feel empowered, because there's nothing worse than that sat there. We've probably all been there in jobs where we sat there going, I've not a clue what I need to do or how I sort this out. And that's when you would turn around to someone and say, can you help me on this? Or, can you talk me through this, etc. But again, take the situation now. Never met those people. I can't ask that. So having the system or even the culture or the network or whatever it happens to be to help people feel comfortable in their role. You're then looking at other things of how do you make people feel valuable? Because I think one of the lessons is that employees have become less subservient to organisations. So they've realised they have power and they are discerning customers of employment. One of the things that I think will come is people will become far more discerning customers of learning, because a lot of learning out there is quite vanilla, not very value adding, quite generic, doesn't really help me. So I think as more and more people start to think, actually, this isn't good enough, or this isn't what I need, or maybe I can go and get something better elsewhere, and realizing what that better is. Because I think we've been in quite a lucky place in some learning teams that there hasn't been a lot of great out there, or there isn't a high expectation from customers. I think as that changes, learning teams need to start to think about how they market and position themselves, and it could be something as clear as having career pathways mapped to people, about thinking about how they show that to current and future employees, how they connect and deliver what people need, or focus on the skills that are going to help people's careers. So I think there's lots of scope for learning teams to help improve the overall employability and experience within their workforces.
Yeah, exactly. They've got a lot more flexibility and they've got a lot more to do than I think that the traditional learning team was seen to do, because I think, and that's a culture shift, that's a mindset change as well, because traditionally people saw learning and the learning teams as people that kind of delivered learning because someone was told to, they were asked that they wanted to do a course, or they wanted to become a project manager, find me some project management content, and you were just kind of providing that service, whether it was providing in-house training or providing or going and sourcing a supplier that would then deliver that training. But with everything that's happened in the past couple of years, we've seen things impact training so much than way before, that we've had to change as a learning team, because you've had things like rules change overnight, literally overnight. You've had regulations put in place. You needed to be able to empower your employees. You needed to be able to, for them to communicate with each other. You needed to have that space to be able to provide all that information. And that's where we saw those teams that were in the kind of more traditional focused way, they struggled a little bit to be able to do that and implement that at pace, because they didn't have the infrastructure behind that to support it. But I think this has highlighted why it's so important to have that kind of blend of learning, so you can support still face-to-face, but you can support online, you can support bite size, you can support different formats, you can have that social element. All of those bits are really important to creating that really great learning culture.
Yeah, and I think there's some interesting developments that have taken place over the last few years. One of the tech-enabled ones I think about, and we've been supporting clients on the last sort of 6 months on, is around sort of validation and verification of learning. And I've always been quite dismissive of that, because I think sometimes people just want a certificate for attendance. I want to show I've done this. I want to be able to show I've done that. And learning to me is always about the application and being able to do that. But I think where people are now being quite creative with things like verified digital badges and thinking about how do we use those in ways to both show that the organisation is investing in people and to promote what we do, promote our brand, or as a membership or training organisation help promote our brand and what we deliver, but also for individuals so that they can actually go out there and go, this isn't just me saying I'm great at this. This is me saying I've done some learning formally. I'm doing informal learning. I've actually put this into practice, etc., etc. So there's some really creative ways we've been working with clients to look at how you can use some of those very traditional things, but reinvent them for the current situation we're facing. So I'm quite excited about those journeys we're going on with clients which have helped reshape their mindset, but also help deliver additional value both back to the organisation and to the learner. because they don't feel like just done this internal training course. They've actually, you can shout about that, you can go through what's covered, and people will always be scared of, oh, if I do that and I allow people to promote what they've done here, well, great. If you're continuing to give them development and support and someone else isn't, you will retain them over time. Some people always jump if there's slight more money there, but they'll come back, or they'll learn to stay if the culture's right, if the development's right, if the support's right, and if the career opportunities are there. That's what people are looking for.
Yeah, definitely. And I think things have improved so much from previously having kind of a PDF certificate that you might stick on your wall. I think with things like badging, etc., actually it's verified. It's really useful to have that, and it's a different way of kind of promoting yourself. It's kind of not that traditional kind of LinkedIn, like, oh, I can put on my LinkedIn profile what I've done, what jobs I've worked in, and that's not particularly verified. I could kind of put whatever I want on that, whereas these other new verified badges is verifying what I have actually done, and people can go on and check that. And like you said, people are moving jobs a lot more quicker than what they did previously. So having that in a space that enables you to do that easily would be even better as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of those things that excites me about our business is being able to support people through understanding and making those transitions. You talked about sort of bite-sized collaborative learning and the place for that. And there's so much out there, but it's really understanding your business case. And that's where we help those people through that journey. So one of the things we have started to see is that, again, with the emergence of a new variant of COVID and more cases, some of those face-to-face events and conferences that were planned and started to happen in the back end of 2021, the ones at the start of 2022 are being pushed back or cancelled. So I think for those people who were hoping to get out and network and socialise and start to meet vendors and all of those things, to try and think how they focus on these challenges going forward. My message to them would be, there's loads of people out there who can help you in the meantime. You don't need to wait for those conferences. The world's moved. There's different ways of engaging with people. There's people like us and various other people out there who can help you navigate those challenges, whether it's learning, whether it's workforce planning, whether it's employee experience. So, we'd love to help people, but if people want to get in touch, we again got a great network of people who might be able to help you facing the challenge that you're facing, even if it's not learning.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's all about having that conversation and then kind of discovering where we can potentially help people, but where the potential issues are. Because I think having that initial call, we've always found, talking to our clients, is that we kind of uncover more not necessarily issues, but more opportunities to kind of make changes within workplaces. But without having that conversation, it's kind of people focus on the one point where they think there's a potential issue, but actually there's lots of other places that we can actually apply that help to, and providing solutions will actually help a lot of other things as well that's happening in the business, that is not completely siloed to learning. For example, it's about user experience, it's about communications as well. So yeah, I think it's having those great conversations early on.
Absolutely, and I'm hoping that 2022 becomes a year of continued conversation and innovation, and we'd love to speak to people or hear from people about the challenges they're facing. If you're wanting to join us on the podcast, please get in touch. If there's an area you want us to focus on or look into or share on a future episode, again, let us know. And if you just want to speak to us individually or as a team, then again, all of those details will be in the show notes below. But Katie, it's been great to catch up, and I'm looking forward to 2022.
Yes, Happy New Year, and looking forward to it as well. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Learning Reinvented podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. If you've not already done so, please follow our podcast. And if the learning effect can help you and your organisation, please do get in touch. You can find both James and Katie on LinkedIn, and our contact details are in the show notes below.